We now actually have a bit more of an idea of some of the policies the Lib Dems might introduce, although, of course, how real is this? I mean, no one's expecting them to be in government, including themselves, unless it's part of a coalition, as Matthew was saying. So there's some question marks and some kind of criminology about what is actually going on here. But what is actually useful is, from this manifesto, we do have some costings, OK? So I can start going through some of the numbers here. And actually, the Lib Dems have been pretty good about this. They've given us some numbers. We can argue about whether the numbers are that reliable, some of them. But nonetheless, they've given us numbers. And now there's a question as to whether the other party leaders give us decent costings in their manifestos coming up later on this week. But the big picture is this, essentially, OK? So the Lib Dems are talking about spending a fair bit more money, about £32 billion extra money, and that's balanced out by about £32 billion of extra revenues. And we'll kind of dig into that in a second. And they want to invest an extra £20 billion, OK? So those are the big figures, and I'll kind of give you a sense later on about what that actually means, how big that is in historical comparison. But if we just take this bit, so the spending, let's just break it down and have a look at what we're talking about here. So if we break this down into the different policies that they're talking about, the biggest one is extra money for the NHS and for social care. So that's about £8.4 billion. And you're talking about, this is where the pledges come in, for more GPs, more cancer research, guaranteed NHS dentistry. Some would say that's not necessarily going to be enough to pay for that, given how expensive a lot of those pledges are. But nonetheless, they think that would cost about £8.4 billion by the end of the Parliament. Then you've got other bits and pieces, like, for instance, extra money on defence. That's £6.7 billion, raising troop numbers, returning that aid spending to 0.7% of GDP. So actually, these two are the biggest things. And then other bits and pieces are considerably smaller than that. And it's worth also looking at where they expect the money to come from. So here you have the revenues, and I've broken this down as well. And by far and away the biggest is the thing that basically every party is promising: avoidance and evasion. They say there's a big gap in the tax system, which there certainly is, between what people should be paying and what they're actually paying. And they think that they can raise £7.2 billion on that, slightly more than the other parties, than Labour or the Conservatives think they could raise. They say they're putting more money into the tax system to enable that to happen. It's worth saying, though, a lot of avoidance right now, it's not necessarily wealthy avoidance. It's you're talking about kind of cash in hand. You're talking about small businesses. So how much of that is going to affect small businesses? The Lib Dems really want to talk about the fact that they want to tax the wealthy, and that's why there's going to be a lot of focus on this. They want to raise capital gains tax, and that's the biggest kind of explicit tax increase you've got that they're proposing here. New bands are 20%, 40%. 45%. They say that if you're at the lower end, you'll end up paying less CGT, but for the 0.1 richest part of the population, they will pay more because they've got these higher rates of capital gains tax. So this is supposed to be a tax on the wealthy, as in things like, for instance, there's a super tax on private jets, you can see over there, a sewage tax, although some would look at this and raise questions. This sewage tax, it's piddling over here. Is this going to be enough to help, get to that objective that Ed Davey wants, that we're not going to have sewage going into the rivers anymore? No way. You're talking about hundreds of billions of pounds potentially to sort out the water system. And where's that going to be paid? Potentially from people's bills. So that's not really resolved within this manifesto, even though there's lots of talk about it. But it's this as well that I think people will focus on. So air passenger duty, £3.6 billion coming from that. And the goal there is to raise £3.6 billion. The issue is that though they say they want to raise this £3.6 billion, they're not exactly clear on what the rate is going to be, so how they're actually going to get to that. They kind of started with, OK, we would like to raise this much, but no clarity on precisely what the rate will be. They say that was down to consultation. But the big picture, and it's worth just kind of going back to the big picture here, because actually this is quite instructive. Remember those bars I showed you at the start? This is how much they want to spend, that's how much they want to bring in taxes, and that's how much they want to invest. That's from this particular manifesto. But how does that compare with the last manifesto? So remember 2019, Jo Swinson had quite a big set of promises in her manifesto. Let's compare the numbers back then. Look at this. So that's this manifesto here, really quite small in comparison to that manifesto where you're talking about double the amount of spending, double the amount of revenues, big changes, massive amounts more investment. Compare that 2019 ambition to this, and, well, it's kind of clear. This is a less ambitious, when you're looking at the fiscal numbers, set of plans, probably, for a lot of people, less scary, but perhaps for some people also less tantalising. But maybe, to go back to what Matthew was saying a bit earlier, that's just part of this more cautious, maybe more realistic Lib Dem's offering.
Ed, I've got lots of questions. I want to ask about the EU debate that they had in there as well in just a moment. But on this particular chart that we're on, for one other question of context, is it also something to do not just with perhaps a less ambitious Lib Dems, but the state of play for the UK economy that might now infect all of the manifestos, which, because you could blame it on the party of government or you could blame it on COVID and the need then to spend a lot more and then pay for it afterwards, that we're going into an election where no party has much flexibility to spend much more than is already being spent without increasing taxes, which are already very high.
Well, potentially. And I mean, another way of casting it is to say, look, there are these fiscal rules that about, the amount that you can spend in the future, the amount of debt that you can take on. Basically, all of the major parties have signed up to them. And if all of the major parties have signed up to them, then there is only a limited amount of extra spending you could do. But that being said, as long as these bars match, and you can see actually they kind of match in that 2019 manifesto as well, as long as the bars match, then it is fiscally neutral, if you believe in these numbers. Like I say, some big question marks over some of the numbers, then it is fiscally neutral. So even leaving aside the fact that there is not much room to spend if you're obeying those fiscal rules, it's not like it's ambitious. It's not like you're kind of changing the nature of the state much. But yeah, like I say, perhaps that's just the kind of pragmatism of where the Lib Dems are now versus 2019.
If we had lots of time, Ed, I might also ask about this ludicrous idea of finding 6, 7, 8 billion, depending which party, and all parties talk about it, you're looking at from clamping down on tax avoidance. That always seems to throw in a little bit of extra spending room for everyone. Just talk me through what you took away from the debate about the EU and better trade terms, albeit without much detail to it.
Well, I mean, that's it's always been, obviously, the big policy for the Lib Dems and the Liberal Party, going back a long way, was about as much EU integration as possible. Remember, the last manifesto was about stop Brexit. This time around, well, this manifesto, it doesn't mention Brexit in the cover. And actually, I was going through it earlier on, just trying to find, OK, so where's the bit about Brexit? Are they still committed to going back into the EU? That's always been a long-time Lib Dem policy. But actually, you have to go all the way back to page, you can barely see it there, page 112. So all the way at the back of this manifesto, on page 112, you find this page. And actually, if we zoom out, I'll just show you the particular line that we're talking about here. Here you go. Look, we are seeking essentially to join the single market. So there we are. So actually, they're not talking about rejoining the EU anytime soon. And as I understand it, that is something that no one, even within the Lib Dems, expects to happen quickly, even if you wanted to rejoin the single market. And there's this line underneath, the road to EU membership, which remains our longer-term objective. But I can't remember another Lib Dem manifesto that is, frankly, quite so relaxed and so quiet about Brexit and EU membership. This is really a massive, massive change from where we are before, but perhaps in the same way that it's a less ambitious fiscal package. The point is, the Lib Dems don't especially want to talk that much about Brexit because they realise it is such a kind of fragile debate. But there we are. It is there, page 112 of the manifesto, in case you're wondering. And it's an interesting manifesto worth looking at, but of course a big question about how much of this stuff is actually ever going to be implemented. Well, that's a debate we'll have to see.